All right, everyone, welcome back to the second half of our discussion on the assault of neoliberalism on social democracy and public health. So, by this point, I'm assuming that you have a good understanding of what neoliberalism offers and what it ultimately produces. And I think that that gives us a better overview of the catastrophic consequences of what happened in Flint, Michigan, where the water wasn't so much toxic, it was effectively poisoned, right, resulting in thousands of people contracting all sorts of diseases, internal skin diseases, brain damage, loss of mental capacities. It's something that if it happened in another country, and a country that the United States had wanted to invade, this would be a pretext for human rights violations. I mean, there's really no other way to describe it. Some of you may remember the Flint, Michigan incident, and it has since been buried within the news. And sadly, those people in charge and those that made the decisions to reroute the water supply from Detroit to the Flint River will probably never see the inside of a jail cell. But the background of the Flint case gives us an understanding of how free market fundamentalism effectively cares little for the disenfranchised, the poor, the peripheral, and how this produces a sense of political culture among those who realize that they are basically on their own. We begin with, an overview of the city of Flint, which, like Detroit, has witnessed just a steady decline in standards of living. Michigan was the heart and soul of this country's automobile industry up to and through the 1980s. But by the early to mid 80s, both cities had since, passed their golden age. And with increasing leverage given to the automobile industries at the direct expense of local politics, companies like General Motors could effectively blackmail local governments into leaving for better, cheaper, more efficient areas. And in return, local governments give them basically whatever they need to stay put. Now, if that means lowering tax rates, if that means defanging the automobile unions, if that basically means allowing these companies to operate relatively uncontested and without any legal consequences to whatever it takes to make a profit, well, then so be it. Of course, with the rise in other automobiles, General Motors kind of declines as a major monopolistic car company. And to sort of move the story along here, right? It's similar to many post-industrial centers in the United States. The money kind of dries up, the jobs go overseas, smaller businesses fail, and the standards of living just become another example of urban blight. These are, cases where we can look at the effects of capitalism without state regulation or any kind of, governmental involvement. So when a city like Flint is on the verge of bankruptcy, and, this we find in many, many urban centers around the country, the state government in Michigan appoints an emergency manager, right? The so-called emergency managers were appointed by Governor Rick Snyder to basically run school districts, cities, kind of take over local politics and rule by decree, right? It's kind of a technocratic approach to I guess in their minds, saving a dying community from, further decline. These happen when states of financial emergencies have been declared. And, it's not just in Michigan. I mean, for a couple of decades, if I'm not mistaken, New Jersey State Police had basically run the police force out of Camden, right? I mean, the city of Camden had, basically looked like, a bombed-out city in World War II. So, these are things that we find in many, many, urban blighted areas around the country. The thing with these emergency managers is that they are unelected and therefore unaccountable by the public. They are given the power to basically sell off public assets and privatize public functions in the name of austerity. Austerity is unfortunately one of the preferred practices of neoliberalism because when the market does fail, and the subsequent withdrawal of the state has, eliminated any kind of, remedy solutions. The only option is to engage in austerity, which is effectively drastic cuts in state services, cuts to wages, cuts to basic social services. It's the economic equivalent to making a decision to lose weight by starving oneself for an entire week. Right, one can exercise, one could change their diet, one could cut back on, let's say, fatty foods and sugars and, alcohol consumption, or you can just simply say, I'm not going to eat at all. I'm not going to change anything else, but I'm just going to starve myself. And well, that's what austerity ultimately is. It's kind of like chemotherapy for an economically blighted area, right? And I think chemotherapy is an even better allegory than starvation, because you have to kind of kill part of you in order to save the rest, right? And that's what austerity effectively does. It just starves a cash-strapped community to halt further indebtedness, with the understanding that cuts to social services, freezing of wages, elimination of jobs will somehow balance the books. And when emergency managers or technocrats or, however way these individuals prefer to be called, and, this is something that we see around the world when, market capitalism fails, banks and organizations like the European Union, among others, they don't have political solutions, they have economic solutions. And if the solution is simply to balance the numbers, then it doesn't really matter about the socio-political repercussions, right? If jobs dry up, if industries move out, if the people are somehow disenfranchised, well, that's just, unfortunate consequences to somehow balancing the books and, stabilizing a declining economy. And, it is within this understanding that a number of draconian decisions are made, again, by individuals who have no public accountability for what they do. And so one of those decisions, and this was green-lighted by Governor Snyder, was to halt the purchase of water from Detroit and start drawing water directly from the nearby Flint River, which is where the city of Flint gets its name from. There was only one big problem with this, and that is the Flint River was already heavily contaminated with lead and other toxins from, environmental sludge spill-offs from these decaying factories, industries that were already given years of economic deregulation in return for, increasing profits, improving productivity, and not moving out of the area, right? So the river basically became a biohazard. And this is now the water in which the residents of Flint will be drawing from for drinking, for cooking, and for washing. Now, the water itself was already heavily polluted, but as Metzel and Giro mention, that the water was so toxic that in being carried from the river through the already aging and decaying pipe networks to get to people's houses, the toxicity of the water actually corroded and dissolved parts of the lead pipes, which led to flaking off of lead into the water to further add to the toxicity and the contamination. So at this point, when it reaches people's glasses, their showers, their cooking pots, thousands of people are, poisoned, resulting in physical ailments, mental deficiencies, brain damage, and shortened life expectancies. Right? This is effectively a crime against humanity. This is, there is no other way to describe it. But there is, as I've said, little possibility that Michigan's elected officials, including Snyder, will ever be prosecuted. And for months, if not years, information was being slowly leaked out into the news about this disastrous decision that was done in the name of cutting costs. I mean, for saving a couple $1,000s, a few tens of thousands of dollars, what ultimately resulted in was a good chunk of the city's population being irrevocably damaged, as I've said, physically, mentally, to such a degree that, I mean, this is sort of almost the equivalent of unleashing a bioweapon on people, right? We constantly get all indignant when countries in the Middle East gas their own people. Well, we're literally poisoning ours. And for the longest time, officials in Michigan had been downplaying this, incident, had been covering up any kind of paper trail that would lead back to individuals making these decisions, went so far as to, even gaslight the local population into saying, well, it's your fault for not maintaining your own pipe networks. It's not ours. Even though enough, experiments were done on the water to say it doesn't matter if this was delivered in the most efficient, modern state-of-the-art water delivery system. This stuff is literally sludge. And this is just toxic, chemically laden sludge. And, it even got to a point where, the then President Barack Obama went to Flint and tried to downplay the incident with the inhabitants and did one of the most unthinkable things that I could imagine. Again, this is him trying to, sort of cover up this idea that there's way too many people in power that dropped the ball on this. And visually drank water from a glass. Now, he kind of put the water to his lips, took the slightest little sip, and said everything is fine. And then people who thought that Obama was going to step in and help and executive order some kind of remedy were just absolutely, absolutely heartbroken. So, the case study of Flint is, beyond simply a tragedy in and of itself, is emblematic of the relative indifference that free market entrepreneurs, private industries, and those with little interest in social welfare have for those people who are politically disenfranchised, marginalized, poor, and altogether unimportant to the larger political process. But you might be thinking to yourself, okay, but wait a minute, Rossi. You spent the whole previous lecture telling me that neoliberalism is really the onslaught of private enterprise, taking the role of what state actors used to do. And if private enterprise is not interested in social welfare and only in making profits, well, how does this fit with the story of Flint, considering that the most guilty people were state actors? Right? So how is neoliberalism a result of this? You might be thinking to yourself, if neoliberalism actually did get involved, they would have either A, paid for and replaced the entire pipe network of water, B, offered to build a state-of-the-art water treatment plant to detoxify the water, or C, just simply bring in bottled water from the outside so people wouldn't have to be drinking this sludge. So how is Flint a victim of neoliberalism, considering that the perpetrators are, political actors? I mean, isn't this really, as I said, the problem of state making decisions, right? This is something that Friedman would have warned about. Would Milton Friedman look at this and say, you see, this is why you shouldn't ever trust government, because look at what Rick Snyder had done? Yes and no, right? Yes and no. What Flint shows us is that neoliberalism, applied neoliberalism, has had a very successful set of cases in which political actors are subordinated to this type of free market fundamental thinking. So the state of Michigan, and specifically the leadership of Rick Snyder, represents government that has been effectively taken over and led by individuals who have openly and unabashedly supported free market-led solutions to the economic downturns that have hit the area since the 1980s. So the decision to save money by rerouting the water system from the Flint River is another one of these technocratic, completely indifferent decisions that are part of a larger collection of decisions for outsourcing, tax reduction of these major companies, environmental deregulation, infrastructure defunding, and all other aspects that tries to convince you, right, that the more independent the market is, the better life will be for everyone. These individuals, right, these political actors, and this is not just Michigan, we see this in multiple places throughout the United States, are political leaders who believe that cuts to state services in the name of austerity will somehow eventually produce a beneficial outcome. And in reality, these have led to the erosion, and in Flint's case, literally the erosion of state infrastructure that, in the hands of private enterprise, will redirect investment towards more profitable areas of Michigan and away from poorer minority inhabited areas. So, in other words, politically charged leaders advocating neoliberalism, if they're going to revitalize something, it's going to be Detroit, right? It's going to be Lansing. It's not going to be Flint, right? Flint is one of those places where you redirect money towards something more profitable, and you let the city atrophy even more. You let the people suffer even more, because Flint is one of those places that you're just going to, eventually cross off the map. So the poisoning of the water system of Flint was a direct product of cost-cutting strategies in the absence of a tax stream. So, by the time the decision is made to engage in austerity measures, right, large areas of Michigan are already experiencing post-industrial economic blight. And how is this the case? It's very easy. Previous 25 years, and in particular, the previous decade, beginning with the Great Recession of 2008, right, resulted in a number of absolutely horrible decisions that were made to bail out many of these companies, corporations, banks. And how did that happen? Bigger tax breaks to the wealthy, bigger tax breaks to these companies, larger and more wider measures of environmental deregulation that reduce the threat of fines and legal consequences for polluting, less job security, no, insurance, the defanging of unions, whatever is absolutely necessary to keep capital flowing. So these tax cuts to these corporations that are also, in themselves deregulated, right? The corporations have allowed to just kind of do whatever they want, have, lead to a drawn out assault on the environment and an impoverishment of state resources, hence the toxicity of the water, right? Environmental regulations, these are seen as expensive. This is seen as something that inhibits the production of capital. And it's not surprising that technocratic solutions for the financial and institutional windfall are going to only think of austerity measures, measures that are targeted towards minority communities and the poor. Not as a one-to-one example of this, but when many countries in Europe were experiencing recession following 2008, 2009, austerity was another one of those solutions that was the only thing that was brought up and implemented. And austerity measures on countries like Greece and Portugal and Spain and even Italy, not only killed any sense of local economies, but it effectively undermined the livelihood and the financial security of ordinary people that had nothing to do with this economic downturn. But again, Greeks are far more politically irrelevant than Germans. African American communities in Flint, a dying, decaying, the place might have already have just been, slated for, eventual abandonment, was seen as a sacrificial lamb for, saving a few $1 million here or there, ultimately couch cushion change for the overall Michigan state budget. Thus the state that, neoliberalism predicts will just simply, roll back and be replaced by forward-thinking, creative, market-driven entrepreneurs are going to be led by officials who ascribe to policies of corporate-driven decisions that are just simply going to redirect money away from the periphery and towards their own cash-strapped coffers. So, in other words, to kind of make a long story short here, the institutional breakdowns in places like Flint are the result of years, if not decades, of state deregulation and technocratic management mismanagement by unelected and unaccountable officials who use the free market as a way of directing capital towards perceived profit and subsequently deregulating and defunding programs and services when those perceived profits need stimulus. Again, in other words, right, deregulation is going to impoverish the periphery. And when more important core areas are also blighted economically, the state will therefore intervene and redirect failing money and industries from the periphery towards the center, which is going to further impoverish, further disenfranchise, and further hurt the people on the periphery. Flint is just that sacrificial lamb. Now, again, you might think to yourself, this is state decisions. How is this really a product of neoliberalism? Neoliberalism has advocated that the state think only in matters of austerity. They have already gutted the state of any social services, social welfare policies, regulatory incentives that prevent things like this from happening. So by the time the water from Flint reaches the faucets of its inhabitants, we already see the byproduct of decades of deregulation, defunding. It really is just the perfect storm. So by the time we get to poisoning in the water, it's not just one decision made by some, evil politician that decided to just hurt all of these people, but they think, well, this is a way of cutting costs and saving some money, and the water that they thought would be there and free and accessible was already a sludge pit because of years of, as I said, environmental deregulation. So neoliberalism is certainly responsible for much of the problems, not just in Flint or Detroit, but in many areas around the country where the failures of free market fundamentalism, create these enormous gaps in social living standards. And while Giraud is also pretty adamant in calling this a type of economic racism, because Flint is heavily populated by African Americans, we turn to Jonathan Metzl's work, Dying of Whiteness, to remind us that white people are just as exploited. Right? Poor peripheral white people are just as overlooked and completely taken advantage of within this economic system. But there's one thing that separates poor, disenfranchised whites from that of blacks. And that is the whites tend to have far more cultural support for this institutional disenfranchisement, economic impoverishment, and health risks in the name of maintaining some semblance of racial and or ethnic superiority. Right? This is one of the big paradoxes of the poor white working class, is that they seem to almost be okay with supporting ideas that hurt them, certainly don't improve their lives, but as long as it doesn't improve the lives of minorities as well, they somehow feel that they can weather this storm, that they can survive this better because it's somehow supporting policies that ultimately benefit other white people. Right? So they're kind of taking one for the team. Again, one of those things that you have to just kind of accept on faith. But that's the reason why we're reading Metzel after Frank, because knowing the backlash narrative, right, we're able to see elements of this emphasizing support for individual freedoms and a mistrust of anything government regulated. So you can also see the connection that the backlash narrative has to these earlier principles of neoliberalism, right? Principles that will look down on and oppose, quote unquote, socialized medicine, because either that gives way too many perks and advantages to, illegal immigrants that don't deserve it, or it's something reminiscent of some communist period that no one ever really knows about, but they were told this is what it's reminiscent of. That's going to get people to just, knee-jerk be against it. But beyond public health, we also need to examine gun safety regulations and restrictions, anything that seems to be infringing on the Second Amendment for whatever reason, right? The Second Amendment people tend to just be absolute fanatics when it comes to making certain that, every American, well, let's be perfectly honest, every white American should have unfettered access to as many guns and as many firearms as possible because it is their constitutional right. And thirdly, right, this general disdain, along with socialized medicine, for a state welfare system, right? So anything that is a public benefit is going to be dismissed and opposed. Individual empowerment is going to be supported. So public goods like a state welfare system, socialized medicine, this is seen as an attack on American freedoms and liberties. Gun possession without any safety measures whatsoever is a way of acknowledging that the individual is responsible for knowing how to handle and maintain firearms, and people who know how to do that should not be prevented, inhibited, or demonized because one or two people, kind of ruin it for the rest of us. I mean, this is kind of the NRA's argument. So, the backlash narrative, which is, deeply, deeply connected to somehow upholding and aiming to restore a series of traditional American values that, exists really on paper only, extends to this support for certain political beliefs and the opposition against any kind of collective public good. Because while it could help whites, it also helps and subsidizes minorities. So it's best that we just kind of get rid of it, altogether. This rests on an assumption, and we can only call it an assumption, but this is what, Metzel's research kind of, unearthed, is that the understanding that deregulation and defunding won't hurt whites as much as it will hurt black and other minorities gives them reason to believe that they can withstand the pain and use it as an incentive to to improve their own lives, right? At the absolute least, right, their tax dollars won't go for something that somehow subsidizes someone else. Whatever paltry money that they make, is sort of, theirs to keep. So this, continues this discussion that we talked about last week and the week before about how this backlash narrative contains a series of understandings, memories, values, and identities that, really just kind of need to be taken on faith. And again, personal freedoms trump collective benefits, even if that collective benefit helps the individual. Nope, personal freedoms first, collective benefits second. Gun possession compensates for defunded police and a rise in crime, right? Especially after every major shooting, what ends up happening, people go to gun stores, gun shows, and they buy more ammunition, right? The understanding is that you can't rely on the police, you can't rely on the state to protect you. It is your responsibility to possess a handgun, a rifle, whatever it is, always in the name of some kind of self-defense. Although, advocates of, gun possession with self-defense also believe in open carry and have absolutely no problem, taking it with them wherever they go. Right? It's not just locked away in one's house. The third assumption of this backlash narrative is that, free market fundamentalism will benefit everyone. And even if it's not benefiting you right now, just wait. It's going to happen. It's right around the corner. Next year is going to be, much better. And the only reason why it's not happening is because big government is still getting in the way, right? So government needs to either be small and limited, or if we can, even get to that point, non-existent altogether. These are kind of like real watered down, debased philosophies that are directly connected to neoliberalism, right? This understanding that the freer the market, the freer the people. Even though, time and time again, evidence has proven that this does not work, right? The freer the market, the more impoverished, the more disenfranchised the people are. So again, looking at, evidence, we see that, the whites possess the highest percentage of the American population who die by self-inflicted gunshot wounds, right? So this is just not something that is, pervasive to all people, blacks, Latinos, Asians, whites. White people are the most likely, to die by self-inflicted gunshot wounds, whether it's suicide, accident, kids getting their hold on the guns because the guns are loaded, all of this, guns, freedom, security, and yet more and more people die by accidental gunshot wounds than in any other country. The second thing we need to understand is that the invisible hand, that is this big element that is taken on faith of the free market, does not benefit everyone, but it just simply increases impoverishment, disenfranchisement, and economic mobility, right? The invisible hand theory, which is really a theory only, it's not ever practiced, right? Again, the invisible hand argues that if left to its own devices, the market is self-regulating. We don't need the state to intervene. State intervention makes things worse. Let the market handle itself on its own as if the market is some living, breathing, organic entity, and it will make the right decisions. What we have found is that in the best case scenario, where the market is led by entrepreneurs, not politicians, to make decisions, those that benefit from it are very, very small. These are the ones that own the companies or are major stockholders and investors. Everyone else is basically left to the fate of the market, right? Jobs can be eliminated at moment's notice. Companies can fold. They can go bankrupt. They can be merged. They can go overseas. They can privatize. Even if you're not part of the company, the deregulatory measures that are put in place to either A, attract the company to set up shop, or B, keep the company from moving away, lead to disastrous results economically, environmentally, geographically. The Walmart effect is probably a great example of this, where a Walmart will come into a town and basically eliminate all smaller businesses. Now, let's be honest here. Walmart is a one-stop shop place, but Walmart will pay people literally pennies on the dollar. I've never met anyone that actually works for a Walmart and likes it, unless you're like a manager and then you make like mad money. But if you actually are a floor worker at Walmart, you're basically just seen as a replaceable, exploitable cog, right? The same thing with Amazon, same thing with, many of these other companies, right? You're just sort of seen as little more than a drone than anything else. So the invisible hand does not help. In fact, it actually makes things even worse. And because free market fundamentalism calls for the defunding and deregulation of social services, as I've said, this produces a deterioration in the quality of life, lower standards of health and education, and shortened lifespans, right? All in the cultural context of somehow this being great for America. Somehow this is going to, produce jobs, make everyone better. State regulatory policies are horrible. Free market entrepreneurs know exactly what they're doing. And even if they don't, the understanding is, and it's one of the best quotes taken from Metzel's work, ain't no way I would ever support Obamacare. I would rather die. We don't need any more government in our lives. And in any case, no way I want my tax dollars paying for Mexicans or welfare queens. You might also remember a couple of weeks ago, there was a blizzard that hit Texas, like this crazy blizzard. in which temperatures were, well below freezing. I mean, and we're not just talking about it being a little cold snap for that part of the country, but we are talking about, infrastructure freezing and breaking down. Like people were freezing to death in their own homes. Why? Because the electrical grid blew out. And why did it blow out? Because local officials in Texas did not want to connect their electrical grid to the rest of the country because that is federal. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, this sounds so unbelievably ridiculous. This understanding that government cannot be trusted to such a degree that certain political decisions will actually risk undermining the security, the safety, and the livelihood of people, but insofar as we don't give any trust or any legitimacy to an already mistrusted government. So, the narratives that define group identity in the wake of the disastrous consequences of 40 years of neoliberalism have kind of, reached levels of absurdism that you have to just kind of take on faith, even if you don't understand how anybody could logically believe this, let alone support this. So to sum up, and I know that this is, a lot of material that we covered this week, right? And I believe that I think a nice recap is certainly in order. A few things to take away as we move into discussion on Wednesday. Number one, the socioeconomic practices of neoliberalism have undoubtedly undermined political freedoms, impoverished millions of Americans, disenfranchised blacks and other minorities, while radicalizing lower-class whites. The lower-class whites are the only group of this disposable set of communities that are sort of taken after they've been beaten, humiliated, ridiculed, and turned into the this angry cabal of reactionary foot soldiers for the very same political elites that have contributed to their impoverishment and disenfranchisement. Number two, the individualization of society that neoliberalism so openly advocates has prevented the formation of collective action and opposition to the commodification of politics, right? So, in other words, people realize how bad things are, but because there's no collective movement, there's no group activity, people tend to feel atomized, isolated. All they can really do is, maybe complain on social media. There's no organization, right? There's no oppositional organization to take these individuals head on. In fact, it's only been, I would say, within the last 4 to 5 years that we've seen some rudimentary foundations of organization, but it's nowhere near as powerful to dislodge the elite-driven actors that perpetuate and push this system, right? If anything, if there is any kind of opposition, it simply produces the need of individual self-preservation and conflict between other socioeconomic groups. Hence the radicalization of the whites, the collective nihilism of the blacks, and when, let's say, police brutality happens, or when there's a mass shooting, one group says defund the police, regulate gun laws. The other one says, don't take away my freedoms. This is the march of the liberal left, taking away the last elements of my rights and liberties, and we just end up with the cacophonous clashes that we've seen in the last year, 2 or 3. Number 3, the political establishment has advanced policies of neoliberalism, while some within that establishment have pushed for a backlash narrative that manufactures opposition to the status quo, but within a cultural framework that promotes traditional American values as opposed to state-sponsored public welfare. So just like Frank's book, What's the Matter with Kansas, Metzel's work, Dying of Whiteness, right, agrees on the same principles. The Republican Party and conservative groups working with them have been actively involved in pushing for deregulation, defunding in the name of just, complete predatory capitalism that enriches the very few, disenfranchises as many people as possible. But the very same people, right, the very same Republican leaders that are advocating for effectively the elimination of the welfare state are now using their power and their influence, but through cultural narratives of defending traditional American ways of life that will get the targeted, the disenfranchised, and the aggrieved white Americans to think that these very same people are fighting for their future, their values, and their economic well-being. Economic assaults on one's way of life is offset by cultural narratives that seem to either A, scapegoat all of these problems on Democrats and coastal urban liberal elites, or simply just obfuscate the entire concept of economic disenfranchisement and place the fate of the country not in the economic debates, but in the sociocultural, right? Gays, Mexicans, immigrants, Muslims, transgenders, socialists, whatever it is that you want to call it, all of them are somehow more important in taking on than, let's say, preserving small town businesses. And it seems to work, right? Because criticism has been disarmed and controlled away from the economic and towards a carefully manufactured set of cultural beliefs. This is also a major product of neoliberalism. One can hate the system, but the system creates a spot for you to oppose it without any real damage, threats to the future of that system. And the last thing to note is that an element of cultural neoliberalism that I've already been talking about, touted by Democrats, that emphasizes inclusion, diversity, and globalization, is projected by Republicans to lower-class white Americans as I've already mentioned, the biggest threat to their way of life and alleged privilege. So important that healthcare, unemployment insurance, organized unions, public infrastructure, and public education are all stigmatized to the point of believing that they are expendable for the sake of maintaining the soul of white traditional America. And again, you might think to yourself, no one could possibly believe this, but it's true. A number of them do take this. And why? As I said last week and the week before, when this is the only narrative that is projected towards large swaths of middle, white, lower-class America without any counter-narrative from the Democrats or others, this is simply taken as matter of fact. So when someone says, like in the previous slide, ain't no way I would ever support Obamacare. I would rather die. We don't need any more government in our lives. And in any case, no way I want my tax dollars paying for Mexicans or welfare queens. You got to think to yourself, what happened in this individual's life that would lead him to think that logically and unapologetically? We find out what that is, we understand why these cultural narratives are as important as they are. So before we, end this discussion, is there a way out of this manufactured immobilization? Right? Is there a way out of this downward spiral? It's one thing for me to talk about this with my colleagues in my mid to late 40s because, we kind of, have passed, a certain point where we're like, well, I can remember at least some good elements of my life. I'm talking primarily to a group of 20-somethings. You are about to inherit this country, and some of you may be thinking it's a damn good thing I've got dual citizenship, because I think I'm going to, start my life someplace else. Are we screwed? I mean, that's the thing. Are we, is this pretty much just a slow, painful death by 1,000 cuts? The good news is that there are multiple ways out of this manufactured immobilization. There are ways out. There are remedies. But all of these remedies, all these solutions, attack the neoliberal status quo. And if you're fine with that, then hey, come join me on the barricades and welcome to the vanguard. But this is an attack on the status quo. This will be perceived as threats to stability. Bernie Sanders is seen as a threat to the status quo. Nina Turner, Rashida Tlaib, to a lesser extent AOC, although she's becoming more and more assimilated into the system, more as the days go on here. But the left is seen as major threats to this system because the left is the one group that says this system doesn't work. I don't care about this system. I don't care about capitalism. I don't care about saving up anything because I don't have nothing to save. But for the most part, true attacks to the system are still relatively minimal. For the most part, the responses tend to be more so on the national populist side. And while left and right are all specters of uselessness, one of the terms that Giraud had mentions, right? The disenfranchised, the unwanted, the disregarded. The Great Backlash is certainly one such response. As long as the majority of this backlash targets the sociocultural aspects of neoliberalism rather than the socioeconomic, then the system is going to survive. It might no longer be as hegemonic as it once was. And a few years ago, I might have been more likely to say that with the election of Donald Trump, the neoliberal hegemonic narrative has been largely discredited. But the foisting of Joe Biden on us by the Democratic Party implies that while we might not return to normal just yet, the Democratic Party is more interested in going with a failed economic ideology so long as it empowers that small political elite than thinking of something larger, than thinking of something alternative. Because, look, attacking the neoliberal status quo means holding all of its political leaders accountable. And we're not just talking about the criminal like Rick Snyder, or we're talking about Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden and Barack Obama and Bill and Hillary Clinton and the Bushes and the Trumps and everyone that has made names for themselves as political leaders and actors within this country. And as I said, we can attack them, but that doesn't mean that they're ever going to be prosecuted, right? Attacking them can just mean politically disenfranchising them at some point. And look, some of them are pushing 80. So if not through collective action, the Grim Reaper will eventually take Dianne Feinstein and Joe Biden away from us. But it is unlikely. It is very unlikely that political leaders like Rick Snyder, who make these decisions to deregulate, defund, and then just completely destroy everything in its wake, will ever be prosecuted and convicted. I will be surprised if he is. I will certainly cheer on his guilty verdict. But I think that a more long-term way out of this sense of hopelessness, a way for the disposable communities to find some purpose, some future within this country, requires a reassessment of democracy that emphasizes the collective rights of the group over the individual rights of the citizen. Right? This is probably the biggest attack on hegemonic thinking, because for as long as I can remember, right, the understanding of democracy was the individual rights of the citizen. And even the neoliberal cultural approaches, right, emphasize individuality, personal wealth, personal gain, personal healing. Very little is done for community development. Very little is considered for collective well-being. And in order for that to happen again, right, this requires the public to take a more active role in democracy as opposed to this passive byproduct of what democracy has been commodified into by free market enterprise. And, if this is something that of neoliberalism have become more and more prevalent since 2016, And I think that as Generation Z and some of the younger members of the millennial crowd, enter adulthood, knowing that they're not going to achieve the American dream because they will be forever in debt, means that this blind faith in market capitalism and this naive belief that hard work will, reward me at some point down the road is just not going to be there, right? It's just not going to be there at all. I mean, I think that, Generation X, me as a Gen Xer, are probably the last real defenders of this old system. And even, the second half of Gen Xers are more than happy to sit back and, watch millennials and Zoomers just, kind of tackle the system, take it on, and just completely disrupt everything in the name of, agricultural co-ops and organic dairy farms. So, a lot remains to be seen. But that really, I think, brings, the coverage of these two readings, to an end for this week. Again, there is a lot to discuss. There is a lot for us to unpack. And I realize that I'm delivering the second half of this lecture later than I normally do. So if you do have a chance to listen to both, that's great. You'll have plenty to contribute in our conversation on Wednesday. If not, and I guess I'm talking to your future self, please make certain that you do cover these two video lectures in time for your reading evaluations and your larger paper. But I look forward to your thoughts and opinions on all of this. This is certainly clear and present topics to discuss, and I'm sure you all have opinions on it. So I'll see you in a couple of days. Take care.